The city never truly slept, and neither did its secrets. For Zephyr, nights were long, lonely walks home, the ache of betrayal still fresh from Caius's deceit. He thought he had escaped the past, but obsession doesn't die. Darien appeared like a shadow, calm, dangerous, and magnetic, a man whose presence carried both protection and power Zephyr couldn't yet understand. And Caius? He wasn't gone. The past waited, lurking in the shadows, ready to reclaim what it had lost. This was no ordinary love story. It was about trust, obsession, and power, about Zephyr, caught between the man who broke him and the man who could destroy everything for him. Zephyr always thought he understood what love meant. It wasn't a dramatic force that stormed into your life. It was subtle, a quiet insistence that never demanded but always lingered. With Caius, it was the way he leaned against the doorframe just to watch Zephyr sip his morning coffee, the soft brush of fingers over the back of Zephyr's hand while they walked down the streets of their small town, the way a shared joke could stretch into hours of laughter that left Zephyr breathless. Everything about Caius felt like gravity, inevitable, constant, and all-consuming. Their apartment had grown into a small world of its own. Books lined the shelves, half-read and dog-eared, the smell of brewed coffee and rain often lingering in the corners, and sunlight spilling across the wooden floor in patterns only Zephyr noticed. Some mornings, he would sit by the window, tracing the lines of light as though reading an invisible story, while Caius hummed in the kitchen, off-key and wholly careless. Zephyr would laugh quietly, a sound he rarely allowed anyone else to hear. And in those moments, he felt a peace he had once thought impossible. They were quiet people in a world that demanded noise, yet their silence spoke volumes. Zephyr shared the things he had buried deep, his insecurities, his fears, his fragile dreams, and Caius received them with an acceptance that left Zephyr's heart trembling. Each secret told was a brick in the fragile cathedral of their love, a structure built not of grandeur, but of trust, intimacy, and the soft, unassuming devotion that rarely announces itself to the world. Evenings were their sanctuary. They cooked together, fingers brushing over counters, teasing about the smallest things, the sound of their laughter mingling with the clatter of pots and pans. Zephyr loved watching Caius move around the kitchen, hair falling over his forehead, sleeves rolled up carelessly, humming a song that belonged only to him. And Caius loved the way Zephyr's eyes sparkled with amusement, the soft sigh that came when he finally allowed himself to rest against Caius's shoulder, the small smile that always lingered after a joke, a word, or a touch. There was, however, a quiet nagging awareness at the back of Zephyr's mind, a whisper he pushed aside, telling him that love could be fragile, that trust could break, that hearts like theirs could be shattered with a careless thought or a moment of weakness. He refused to dwell on it. For now, he allowed himself the illusion of safety, the comfort of a love that seemed indestructible. Every hand held, every whispered word, every shared smile was a testament to something real, something enduring, something worth cherishing even in the presence of uncertainty. And so, they existed in that delicate balance, blissful and unaware, hearts entwined and defenses lowered. For Zephyr, there was no past that mattered and no future that intimidated. There was only Caius, only the warmth of his hand, the softness of his laughter, the inexplicable pull that drew him closer and closer until the world beyond their apartment faded entirely. I had always trusted him without question. Caius had a way of making everything feel safe, of turning ordinary moments into memories I never wanted to forget. And I believed, blindly, that he felt the same way, that the quiet devotion I saw in his eyes, in the way he held my hand, in the way he whispered my name late at night, was real. That belief was my anchor, my certainty. I should have noticed the small signs first, the way his phone vibrated a little too often, the secretive smiles he tried to hide, the way he sometimes lingered over his messages, just a moment too long, but I told myself I was imagining it, that love was supposed to be effortless, and that suspicion was a poison only weak hearts brewed. My heart was not weak. I thought. It wasn't until that evening, the one that would forever split my life into before and after, that I realized the fragility of my faith. I had returned early from work, intending to surprise him with the little dinner I had made, the scent of fresh herbs and roasted chicken trailing behind me. The apartment was too quiet when I stepped inside. the familiar hum of our small world absent. I called his name softly, expecting the lazy, teasing reply he always gave, the one that made me grin, but there was nothing. And then I heard it, the laughter, his laughter, not my laughter, not the laughter we shared, a different laugh, the kind that belonged to someone else. My stomach tightened, a cold coil twisting inside me. I froze at the threshold of the living room, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that I had imagined it, that the universe was cruelly playing tricks on me. But it was real. And there he was, Caius, leaning against the couch, the light from the lamp casting soft shadows over the person curled next to him, someone whose smile belonged to him, whose hand lay casually on his arm in a way that had once been mine. Every detail was a dagger. Every movement, a reminder of the trust I had offered freely and foolishly. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear him apart for the betrayal, to demand answers, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain I was drowning in. But my body refused to move. My throat tightened, and the world around me seemed to fracture into shards of disbelief and anguish. Caius turned toward me, his expression flickering between surprise and guilt, and it broke something in me that I could never put back together. "What, Zephan?" His voice trembled, the sound both familiar and horrifyingly distant. I saw the excuses forming, the lies he had surely practiced in his mind for the moment he might be caught. But I didn't wait to hear them. I couldn't. I turned and fled. I didn't pack, didn't argue, didn't explain. I left our apartment, our memories, our life together behind, my chest aching as if it had been hollowed out. I walked aimlessly through the streets, ignoring the biting cold of the night air, ignoring the familiar sounds of the city that had once brought me comfort. Every step was heavy with betrayal, every breath a reminder that the person I had loved most had deliberately shattered the world I had trusted him to protect. I didn't speak to him again. I didn't answer his calls, his texts, his desperate messages full of apologies I couldn't bear to read. I existed in silence, in shadows, nursing a wound that refused to heal. Every memory of him twisted in my mind, every shared laugh now poisoned with what I had discovered. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I been blind? Had I misread everything? Or had I simply been too trusting, too foolish to see what was always there? Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I learned to walk through the world without him, to exist without the warmth of his hand in mine. But there was always a part of me that lingered in that apartment, in that room, in those stolen moments. A part of me that still loved him, despite the betrayal, despite the emptiness, despite the gnawing ache of heartbreak that never fully subsided. And yet, even in my solitude, I made a vow that if he ever came back, he would not find the same Zephan who had trusted him without question. That man was gone, burned away by deceit and grief. The next time he saw me, I would be untouchable, guarded, sharper than the memory of his betrayal. And if he tried to hurt me again, I would make him pay, not with violence, but with the most piercing weapon I had, indifference, a life rebuilt, and the quiet satisfaction of watching him realize the consequences of his choices. The weeks that followed were a haze of emptiness and silent streets. I moved through my apartment mechanically, performing the motions of life without feeling their weight. Cooking became a ritual I barely noticed, the smell of roasted chicken or fresh herbs failing to stir any comfort. Nights were worse, the darkness pressing in, my thoughts circling relentlessly around the image I couldn't unsee, the sound of laughter that had once belonged to me, now belonging to someone else. I told myself I would never cry, that I would never allow him to see me broken, but the tears came anyway, quiet and unrelenting in the solitude of my bedroom. Tried to fill the void with routines, with work, with trivial distractions. I forced myself to walk through the city streets during the day, to watch strangers pass, to lose myself in their ordinariness. But everywhere I went, there were reminders. The small cafes where we had lingered, the bookstores where we had spent hours wandering, the park bench where he had leaned against me and whispered that he loved me. They were fragments of a life I could no longer touch, shards of memory that pricked at my skin and sank into my chest like ice. Sometimes I imagined running into him on the street, imagined seeing the guilt etched on his face, imagined him begging for forgiveness that I had no intention of granting. I wanted to yell, to demand that he explain why, to tear out the years we had shared and hold them up before his eyes. But even in my fantasies, I didn't allow myself the satisfaction of closure. Instead, I let the anger fester quietly, a slow burn that hardened my heart into something sharper, something unapproachable. Friends reached out, but I pushed them away. I needed distance, solitude, a chance to rebuild the pieces of myself he had shattered. Nights became longer, silent walks through the city streets stretching into early mornings. I watched the first light touch the pavement and felt the small, stubborn beat of life inside me. Fragile, but real. And I told myself over and over that I was stronger than this, that I would not allow a single betrayal to define me. It was during one of those long walks that I first noticed him. Not Caius, of course, not yet. Someone else, walking with a quiet confidence, someone whose presence felt like a shield I hadn't realized I needed. He didn't look at me, didn't speak, but there was a gravity to him that tugged at something long dormant inside me. I didn't understand it then, and I didn't allow myself to think about it. But the seed of curiosity had been planted. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt the stirrings of possibility. Not love, not yet, but the faint flicker of life beyond grief, the subtle acknowledgement that the world could still hold something worth noticing. I had vowed never to let Caius touch my heart again, but perhaps, I thought cautiously, perhaps life had other plans. And even as I walked past him without a word, I felt the faintest, unreasoning hope that I could learn to breathe again, that I could survive the wound he had left behind, and that someday I might even reclaim the warmth I had lost. The first time I saw him, I didn't know what to think. I was sitting in a small cafe I had taken to frequent, a place with peeling paint on the walls and the faint scent of roasted beans lingering in the corners, trying to lose myself in the hum of strangers and the murmur of conversations that weren't mine. I was halfway through a book I had barely started, my mind still looping over Caius, when he walked in. He didn't notice me at first, didn't glance around or make a scene. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made the space around him feel heavier, more grounded, and somehow safer. He ordered in a voice that was low but carried, precise without arrogance, and when he turned, his eyes briefly met mine. I felt a jolt I couldn't explain, a sudden tightening in my chest that was equal parts curiosity and caution. I didn't know him, and yet in that fleeting moment there was a strange sense of recognition, as if the universe had finally acknowledged the ache I carried. I looked away quickly, scolding myself for the thought, for the flutter of something I wasn't ready to name. Over the next few weeks, he began to appear in the edges of my life. Not deliberately, not in a way that demanded attention, but always there, a familiar shadow in the background of cafes, bookstores, and quiet streets. Sometimes our paths crossed directly. He would offer a polite smile, a simple nod, never forcing conversation, never prying. And yet slowly, he began to occupy a space in my mind that I had reserved for nothing but memories of Caius. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the way a small plant grows through a crack in concrete, stubborn and insistent. I found myself seeking him out without admitting it, listening to the cadence of his voice when he spoke to the barista, noting the way he moved with an ease I envied, the subtle care in his gestures, the way he seemed to notice small details that everyone else ignored. I hated myself for it, for the flicker of something that could have been attraction, for the dangerous curiosity that threatened to unravel the careful walls I had built around my heart. And yet, despite myself, I began to feel a sense of comfort in his presence, a quiet reassurance that perhaps life had not abandoned me entirely. One evening, the coincidence became undeniable. I had left the cafe later than usual, stepping into the chill of early autumn, when he appeared on the sidewalk ahead, walking toward me. Our eyes met, and I braced myself for awkwardness, for intrusion into my carefully maintained solitude. But instead he smiled, soft, unassuming, and entirely without expectation. "Mind if I walk with you?" he asked. His voice was calm, measured, but there was something in it that suggested patience and understanding, as if he knew the boundaries I had drawn and had no intention of crossing them. I hesitated, then nodded. And so we walked, side by side, without speaking at first, the silence stretching comfortably between us. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. A sense of ease, of tentative trust, of the faintest glimmer of life returning to a heart I had thought broken beyond repair. It didn't happen all at once. I didn't fall into some immediate connection, didn't mistake his presence for a replacement of what I had lost. But each encounter, each brief smile, each quiet exchange began to chip away at the bitterness I carried. Slowly, insidiously, he began to make the world feel less cold, less hollow, less defined by the betrayal I had endured. And I realized, with equal parts fear and wonder, that I was beginning to hope again, that perhaps in the edges of this new life, I could find a fragment of the warmth and safety I had lost. A space where Caius's betrayal no longer defined me, and where I could, cautiously, learn to trust once more. I hadn't meant to notice him again, but there he was, leaning casually against the counter of the small cafe I had begun frequenting. He looked up as I approached, and his eyes met mine, calm but piercing in a way that made me falter. I didn't know why my chest tightened. I hadn't wanted to feel anything, yet here I was, drawn into the orbit of someone I barely understood. "Hey," he said, voice low but steady. "I'm Darien." There was no flourish, no exaggerated charm. Just a simple introduction that somehow carried weight. His hand extended lightly, and I found myself shaking it, awkwardly, my fingers brushing against his. There was a certainty in him I couldn't ignore, a quiet assurance that made me want to let go of some of the tension I had been carrying for months. "Zephyr," I replied, voice barely above a whisper. My heart betrayed me with a flutter I didn't want to admit. He smiled faintly, not smug or teasing, but with an ease that suggested he understood the weight of unspoken things. "It's nice to finally meet you properly. I've noticed you here a few times. You always seem distant, but in a way that makes you impossible to forget." There was no flirtation in his tone, just observation, sharp and steady, and it made me shift slightly under his gaze. I blinked, unsure what to say. I guess I trailed off, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I felt speaking to him. I hadn't wanted anyone near enough to see the fractures in me, the echoes of what Caius had done. Darien leaned casually against the counter, one hand tucked into his pocket, his posture relaxed but commanding at the same time. "No need to explain," he said lightly, tilting his head. "I'm not here to judge. I just think you shouldn't carry it all alone, not if you don't want to." His voice held something I hadn't expected, neither pity nor intrusion, but a subtle offer of understanding, like he was reaching out without touching, acknowledging my walls without demanding they fall. I swallowed hard, unsure why his presence was already leaving an imprint on me. "I appreciate that," I managed, staring down at my hands. I wanted to tell him everything, but even this small exchange was overwhelming. "Good," he said softly, and there was a quiet warmth to it that made my chest ache in ways I couldn't name. "Maybe we can talk sometime. No pressure. Just talk." He gave a brief nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, and then he stepped back, blending into the ambient noise of the cafe as naturally as he had appeared. I left soon after, my mind buzzing. His name, Darien, repeated in my thoughts, clinging to me like a secret I couldn't yet admit. Something about him was different. Not like Caius, not like anyone I had known. There was an edge of steadiness, of quiet strength, that seemed to challenge the way I had lived in shadows for months. Later, when I replayed the encounter, I found myself remembering not just his name or his words, but the way he had said them, the care without intrusion, the interest without pressure. I realized, with both fear and curiosity, that I wanted to see him again. That I wanted to hear him speak, to share small moments, to let the fragile spark he had ignited grow without acknowledging it too soon. And even as I told myself to be careful, to guard my heart from being touched again, I couldn't deny the truth. Darien had already made a mark, subtle and undeniable, and I found myself waiting, almost impatiently, for the next time our paths would cross. The days after our encounter in the cafe passed in a blur of routine and subtle anticipation. I found myself scanning every corner of the streets I walked, half hoping, half dreading, that I would see him again. And then, one evening, I did. He was leaning against a brick wall, just outside the small bookstore I frequented, hands tucked into his coat pockets, posture relaxed yet alert, as if he belonged to the shadows of the street itself. "Zephin," he called softly as I approached. The sound of my name on his lips made me pause, my heart skipping. "I was hoping I'd see you tonight." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I just came out for a walk," I muttered, feeling my face heat. He smiled faintly, a corner of his lips tilting with a subtle confidence that made me feel exposed in the best and worst ways. "Good, walks are better with company," he said lightly. There was no pressure, just the calm assertion that he wanted to share this space with me, and something about the simplicity of it made me want to relax, even as my chest fluttered with nerves. We walked in silence for a few blocks, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot the only sound besides the faint hum of the city at night. He fell into step beside me easily, his presence grounding, though it also stirred an unexpected restlessness I couldn't name. "Do you come here often?" he asked, voice casual but pointed. I swallowed, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes. It's quiet, easier to think." He nodded, and for a moment I caught the faintest glimmer of something behind his eyes. Awareness, curiosity, maybe even caution. I can understand that. Quiet is underrated. Most people don't notice what it offers. He glanced at me briefly, the kind of look that seemed to weigh me without intruding. I tried not to blush. I guess I just like being alone sometimes." "Alone doesn't have to mean lonely," he replied softly. "But if you ever want someone to walk with, I can do that." His hand brushed mine by accident, or so I told myself. But I felt it, felt the heat of it, the steady strength behind the casual gesture. We continued in silence after that, the night folding around us like a soft cloak. And I realized, with a mixture of relief and unease, that I was beginning to anticipate these moments, that I wanted to hear him speak, that I wanted to share pieces of myself I had locked away since Caius's betrayal. Later, he stopped and looked at me directly, eyes holding mine with quiet insistence. "I know it's sudden, and I don't want to push," he said, voice low. "But I want to know you, really know you. If you'll let me." Something inside me stirred. Caution, yes, but also longing. I wanted to say no, to retreat into the safety I had built. Yet I found myself whispering, almost without thinking, I want that too." He smiled again, a subtle curve of lips that felt like sunlight slicing through shadows. "Then, let's start slow," he said. "No rush, no expectations, just getting to know each other." And so we walked, side by side, a quiet rhythm forming between us that was fragile but undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of warmth that was untainted by betrayal or fear. I would know where this path would lead, and I didn't want to rush the answer. But with Darien, I finally allowed myself to think of him as more than a fleeting shadow. The weight of the past seemed a little less suffocating, and the world a little less lonely. Pre-PHT, pre-PHP, pre-PH. I didn't expect to feel his presence again. Not like this. Caius had always had a way of creeping back into my mind when I least wanted it. A shadow I tried to ignore. But tonight, it was different. I saw him from across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, eyes scanning the cafe where I had just stepped inside. My chest tightened involuntarily, a mixture of irritation and lingering pain bubbling up. I didn't want him to notice me. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me alive, breathing, moving on. And yet, the moment his gaze swept over me, a shiver ran through my spine. Not of fear, but of memory. Every touch, every laugh, every lie we had shared flashed in an unbearable sequence, reminding me why I had left. Darien, walking slightly ahead, noticed the tension immediately. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the knot forming in my chest. I barely had time to nod before Darien's hand brushed mine, grounding me in the moment. The contact was subtle, protective, and it anchored me. I realized how instinctively I leaned on him now, how his presence had begun to form an unspoken shield around me. Caius's eyes narrowed. I saw it then, the flicker of something I recognized too well, jealousy. The The same possessiveness I had once known as affection, now twisted with envy and regret. I wanted to look away, to disappear into the crowd, but something kept me rooted. I wanted him to see that I had survived, that I had moved on. Not completely, perhaps, but enough to remind him what he had lost. Darien spoke again, quieter this time, almost a whisper in my ear. Ignore him. He's not part of this. His fingers tightened briefly around mine, and I felt a heat rush through me, a fierce reassurance that made my chest swell with a mix of fear and gratitude. There was a calm authority in his voice, the kind that didn't ask but commanded my attention, and it made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt in months. I watched as Caius hesitated, then stepped forward, his face twisted between longing and anger. "Zephan, wait," he called. My heart tightened, old feelings clawing at the edges of my mind. But I didn't turn. I wouldn't let him see me falter. "I'm not your concern anymore," I whispered under my breath. More to myself than anyone else. Darien's gaze met mine, understanding, steady, protective. He didn't say a word, just stayed close, his presence a silent promise that I didn't have to face the chaos of my past alone. Caius's steps faltered. I could see it in the way he froze, realizing, or perhaps finally acknowledging, that I had changed, that I wasn't the same person who had loved him blindly, that I was not to be taken for granted. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow at the sight, knowing that the pain he had caused would now echo back to him in ways I didn't have to orchestrate. Darien squeezed my hand slightly, a reminder of where my loyalty now belonged, and I drew a deep breath, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. The night was cold, the streets empty, and yet I felt warmth radiating from him, a protective barrier I hadn't known I needed. Caius's shadow still lingered across the street, but it no longer held power over me. Not with Darien here, not with the slow, quiet certainty that someone new could care for me differently, fiercely, completely, and without betrayal. And in that moment, I realized the shift. I was no longer the Zephan who had cried alone in empty rooms. I was standing tall, hand in hand with someone who mattered, someone whose presence alone made me feel unassailable. Caius could watch, could ache, could regret, but the choice and the life I was beginning to build belonged to me. The following days were a subtle war I hadn't expected. Caius began appearing where I least wanted him to, his presence sharp and deliberate, a constant reminder of what I had endured. Each time I saw him, my chest tightened, a mixture of anger and old longing that I couldn't fully name. I had promised myself I wouldn't falter, that I wouldn't let him see me broken again, yet the effort it required was exhausting. Darien noticed immediately, his gaze flicking toward Caius whenever he appeared. One evening, as we walked through a quiet alley, Darien's hand brushed against mine, firm, grounding. "He's watching," Darien said softly, almost a growl, the subtle edge in his voice enough to make me flinch. I swallowed hard, looking down at our joined hands. I know, I'm okay. You don't look okay," he said, his eyes locking on mine, sharp and unwavering. "And I don't want to see him hurt you again." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and relief. Darien wasn't just protective, he was insistent, a presence I could rely on without question. Yet the fact that Caius was here, lurking, trying to reclaim what he had lost, gnawed at the edges of my composure. Later, at the cafe where we often met, Caius finally spoke, his voice tense, dangerous. "Zephan, you don't need him." I looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time in weeks. "I don't need you either," I said firmly, the words tasting like fire on my tongue. "You left. You betrayed me. This is my life now." Caius's jaw tightened. "You think he can protect you? He doesn't know." "He knows enough," Darien interjected calmly, yet his voice carried a weight I hadn't realized before. I turned to see him watching Caius with something I hadn't fully recognized: control, confidence, a subtle warning that he was not someone to be trifled with. "I know enough," he said slowly, deliberately, "to make sure no one hurts him, especially you." Caius's face paled slightly, though he tried to mask it with anger. I felt a surge of something I hadn't expected, pride, maybe, or relief, that Darien could stand so firmly beside me. The tension between them was electric, and I realized that for the first time, I wasn't the only one carrying weight in this confrontation. Darien reached for my hand again, fingers entwining with mine, his grip strong but not tight. "You're mine," he said softly, but the words carried a promise, not possessiveness. "I won't let anyone take you from me. Not him, not anyone." I felt my heart tighten in ways I hadn't allowed for months. Safe, protected, desired. The feelings were overwhelming, but for the first time since Caius's betrayal, they were also untainted by fear or pain. I realized then how much I had been starving for this. Someone who didn't just want me, but would actively protect me from harm. At part, Caius said nothing after that. He stood there, stiff and frustrated, a ghost of the man I had once loved. And as he finally turned and left, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The past was still present, but for the first time, I felt capable of moving forward, of embracing something real, something fierce and unwavering. Darien squeezed my hand once more, leaning slightly closer. "Don't worry about him," he murmured. "From now on, I've got you." I let out a shaky breath, the weight on my chest lifting slightly. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, of trust, and of warmth. The world wasn't safe yet, and Caius's shadow lingered, but with Darien by my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. The city felt smaller now, almost suffocating. Everywhere I went, I sensed Caius lurking, a shadow in the corners of my vision, a reminder that the past I had tried to bury was still breathing. It wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was obsession, raw and insistent, and I could feel it vibrating through the air whenever he was near. Darien noticed it immediately, his gaze flicking toward every movement, every passing figure, sharp and calculating. "He's close," Darien said softly as we walked along a dimly lit street, his voice low, almost dangerous. "I can feel it. He wants something he can't have." I kept my silence, trying not to let fear show, but Darien's presence was a balm, a shield I hadn't realized I needed so desperately. "I don't know what he's thinking," I admitted quietly, my fingers tightening around his. "He's thinking you're still his," Darien replied without hesitation, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "But he's wrong. He doesn't get to decide that anymore." We walked in tense silence, the night wrapping around us like a cloak. Every shadow seemed to twist, every distant sound set my nerves on edge. And yet Darien stayed close, his hand firm around mine, his eyes scanning, calculating, alert. It was unlike anything I had ever felt, someone who didn't just offer words, but an unspoken promise that he would act if needed. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke, softer this time, leaning slightly toward me. "Zephyr, you don't have to face him alone. Ever. Not again." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent months hiding, surviving, avoiding vulnerability. And now, here was someone who didn't just want to be with me, he wanted to protect me. And that thought sent a shiver through me, a mixture of relief, desire, and something I wasn't ready to name. As we turned a corner, Caius finally appeared again, his expression twisted with desperation and envy. "Zephyr, please, just listen." "Stop," I said sharply, my voice steady. But before I could step closer, Darien subtly moved ahead, positioning himself between me and Caius. His presence was commanding, almost magnetic, and I felt the weight of authority in his stance. "You don't get to touch him," Darien said, low and calm, but every word carried a threat I didn't doubt. Caius froze, the tension crackling in the cold night air. I realized then how different this was. I wasn't alone. I wasn't vulnerable. Darien wasn't just by my side. He was a force I hadn't anticipated, a presence that made me feel both safe and intrigued. Caius's eyes darted between us, frustration flaring. "You think you can keep him? He's mine," I interrupted, his voice calm but cutting, like steel beneath velvet. "And if you try again, you'll regret it. I won't warn you twice." I felt my chest tighten, but it wasn't fear this time. It was awe, admiration, something deeper that stirred in me. Darien wasn't just protecting me, he was staking a claim with quiet authority, a strength that made my pulse quicken. Caius finally turned and stormed off, leaving us in the dim glow of the streetlights. I exhaled shakily, relief and adrenaline mingling. "Thank you," I whispered, barely audible. Darien's lips curved slightly, almost a smirk, as he lowered his hand to brush my fingers. "Don't thank me yet," he said softly. "I'm not finished. You're not going to be alone again. Ever." Something in those words settled in my chest, a mix of longing and reassurance. For the first time in months, I felt secure, protected, and undeniably drawn to him. And even as my mind whispered caution, my heart couldn't help but race. This was new. This was real. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't haunted by Caius. A future where someone like Darien could stand beside me, fierce, unyielding, and entirely his own. The streets smelled of rain and asphalt, the air sharp with the chill of evening. I had just left work, my bag slung over my shoulder, and the familiar ache of exhaustion clung to me. The sidewalks were nearly empty, a few stray cars passing, the city quiet for the first time in hours. Then I saw him, Caius, standing too close to the corner where I usually waited for the bus, his eyes fixed on me with a predatory intensity. My stomach twisted. "Caius," I muttered under my breath. Before I could react, he stepped forward. "Zephan, just a word," he said, voice low, urgent. "Please, I need you to listen." I froze, a shiver running down my spine. "Don't," I said sharply, trying to step past him, but he moved faster, blocking my path. Panic flared in my chest, sharp and immediate. And then the sound of a car engine cut through the quiet. A black sedan skidded to a stop in the middle of the street, tires hissing on wet asphalt. The door swung open, and Darien stepped out. He didn't run, didn't yell, didn't even hurry. He just walked, slow, deliberate, every step measured, and the world seemed to shrink around him. Caius's expression faltered for a fraction of a second. I noticed the change immediately. This was no ordinary man stepping onto the street. The air around Darien seemed thicker, heavier, like the weight of something dangerous pressed into the night itself. "You shouldn't have come here alone," Darien said quietly, his gaze locked on Caius. There was no tremor in his voice, only control, power, and an unmistakable warning. Caius sneered, trying to mask his unease. "So this is your knight in black armor?" he spat. "You think you can stop me?" Darien tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat, the city felt suspended. Then he moved, fast, precise, but not hurried. A single step closer, and the air between him and Caius seemed to crackle with an invisible force. Caius flinched, caught off guard by the presence, but didn't step back entirely. He was dangerous, desperate, obsessed, not weak, not yet. I took a shaky step backward, my heart hammering. The streetlights flickered across Darien's face, sharp and unreadable, and I realized this was a man who could erase threats before I even comprehended them. My pulse raced, part fear, part awe. Caius lunged suddenly, reckless, his hand grabbing at me. My scream barely left my lips when Darien moved, not just to intercept, but to control the entire space. He swept his arm, forcing Caius back, and the street seemed to shiver with the sheer intensity of the force he radiated. "Back off," Darien said softly, terrifyingly calm. His voice was like ice sliding over steel, and Caius froze mid-motion. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Darien's gaze softened only slightly as he stepped toward me. His presence still absolute, but grounding. "Are you hurt?" he asked. My legs were trembling, my chest tight, but I nodded, unable to speak. Caius backed off, rage and obsession mixing in his expression, and for a moment, the tension hung in the air like smoke. I realized then, he was still dangerous, but Darien was a storm I hadn't yet understood, a storm I was suddenly grateful to stand beside. The moment Caius stumbled backward from Darien's presence, I thought it was over. I was wrong. He lunged again, faster this time, reckless desperation in every movement. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to sidestep, my heels scraping the wet pavement. "Caius, stop!" I screamed, but he didn't listen. Darien moved instantly, but not like a normal man would. He didn't just block or intercept, he commanded the space around him. The street seemed to shrink, the shadows bending toward him, and I realized with a jolt that he wasn't just strong, he was untouchable. "You've lost your right to him," Darien said quietly, his voice calm, almost casual, but every word hit Caius like a hammer. There was no shouting, no threats, just a quiet authority that made even me shiver. Caius's fists clenched, but he didn't retreat. "You think you can scare me? I know him. I know him better than you ever will." His words came out sharp, desperate. Darien's lips curved faintly, almost amused. "You think you do," he said smoothly, stepping closer, and then, suddenly, he moved faster, fluid, predatory, like a shadow slicing through light. With a subtle flick of his wrist, Caius was shoved back several feet, stumbling on the wet asphalt. His hands scrabbled for balance, and I gasped, heart hammering. "Darien!" I exclaimed, rushing forward, but his eyes caught mine, calm, controlled. "Stay back," he said softly, firm, dangerous. "I've got this." Caius recovered immediately, fury blazing in his gaze. "You think this will stop me? You don't know who you're dealing with." He charged again, reckless and wild. Darien's expression shifted subtly, eyes narrowing, and the air between them snapped with tension. Then, without warning, Darien moved like lightning. One arm extended, and Caius was thrown off balance, crashing against the hood of a parked car. I flinched at the sound of metal scraping metal, my stomach twisting. Caius struggled to rise, breathing hard, chest heaving. You can't." "I already can," Darien interrupted, voice low, ice cold. "And if you touch him again, I swear you'll regret it." The calm power in his tone was terrifying. I felt it ripple through me, thrilling and frightening at once. Caius's eyes darted to me, a flash of obsession and despair, but he didn't move closer. He was beaten, but not broken. His jealousy, his need, his desperation were still alive, simmering dangerously beneath the surface. Darien stepped closer to me, hand brushing against mine, grounding, protective, intimate, but not smothering. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. His gaze softened and my pulse raced. "No one will ever hurt you again. Not him, not anyone." I nodded, chest still pounding. The adrenaline was fading, but the awe remained. Darien wasn't just my protector, he was a force, a man I had underestimated, a storm contained in human form. And Caius was still dangerous, still obsessive, still a threat. But now I understood something. With Darien here, I was no longer powerless. The night stretched around us, tense and alive. Caius retreated into the shadows, muttering threats that were more venom than promise. I exhaled shakily, gripping Darien's hand. That was intense. He smiled faintly, calm, dangerous. "This isn't over," he said softly, eyes flicking toward the empty street. "But I'm not leaving your side." And I realized then, with a mix of relief, desire, and fear, that I had stepped into a world I couldn't escape. A world of danger, obsession, and overwhelming power. But for the first time, I wasn't alone in it. The street was quiet again, but the tension lingered, thick as smoke in the night. Zephan clutched Darien's hand, chest still racing, eyes darting toward the shadows where Caius had disappeared. He had no idea, but somewhere unseen, Caius's obsession had not ended, and neither had the danger he carried. Darien's gaze softened slightly as he watched Zephan, exhaling a quiet sigh. "You need to know the truth," he said, voice low, deliberate, though his words carried layers Zephan couldn't grasp. "I'm not just protecting you for affection. I have a world, Zephan, a world that can be lethal." Zephan tilted his head, curiosity and awe mingling in his expression. What do you mean?" Darien looked past him, eyes darkening, momentarily distant. "I'm at the top of a family. Decisions I make ripple further than you could imagine. And some threats, they must be handled differently." Zephan blinked, a shiver running down his spine. I don't care. I trust you. That's all that matters." Darien's lips curved faintly. "Good, because you will always be mine." His fingers brushed Zephan's cheek, tender, grounding. "No one can take you from me. Not him, not anyone." Behind them, the night held its own secret. Caius had returned, reckless, obsessed, believing he could reclaim what he had lost. He thought he could confront Zephan again. But Darien did not need to move to control him. His mere presence, lethal and unreadable, was enough to make Caius hesitate. And while Zephan felt relief, awe, and trust, he had no idea what was happening beyond his view. Quiet shadows moved swiftly, unnoticed. Men from Darien's network, precise and efficient, appeared like ghosts, surrounding the street, Caius, desperate and defiant, was caught, struggling futilely against the unseen hands that seized him. He never realized the trap until it was too late. A black van, doors silent in the night, waited nearby. Caius's screams and threats were muffled before they reached Zephin's ears. By the time the sound of metal and tires echoed faintly in the distance, he was gone. Zephin felt only Darien's hand on his, warm, protective, intimate. He saw Caius vanish into the shadows and assumed the threat had fled. He believed Darien had simply scared him off. Relief flooded him, and he whispered, trembling, "I'm with you." Darien smiled, a dark, satisfied curve of his lips. "And you always will be," he murmured, his other hand brushing Zephin's hair from his face. To Zephin, it was comfort and love. What Zephin did not know, what he could never know, was that Caius would never return. The night stretched around them, charged, alive. Zephin clung to Darien, heart pounding, unaware of the lethal undercurrent that had secured their safety. In the shadows, Darien's power was absolute, merciless, and precise. The danger had been eliminated, forever hidden from Zephin's sight. Zephin exhaled shakily, believing peace had returned, trust complete. Darien let him lean into him, holding him close, the city around them alive but irrelevant. To Zephin, the world was finally safe. To the author's eye, it was a perfect, calculated closure, obsessive threat neutralized, protector revealed in full, and the line between love and lethal power blurred seamlessly in the night. Bittersweet, dangerous, unshakable, theirs as intended.